Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm here with Inez, and we're recording this on May 25th. This is like the first day of the 2024 election. I mean, it's appropriate we're doing this today because Ron DeSantis is now officially a candidate. He kicked off last night with a Twitter space that didn't really go well. So every headline, you probably see the montages of everything from Fox News to the New York Times to they're receiving a political story about all these DeSantis boosters in the media who are always also saying what a disaster it was. So he comes in 25 minutes basically late. When you've had like a glitchy Zoom call, it's like in and out, and it's like frustrating because it's like waiting, but like you never know if it's going to work or when it's going to work. To me, that's like the worst kind of waiting. And so people are just sitting there on Twitter waiting for this thing to kick off. And yeah, I mean, the idea is that it's disastrous, but who knows? Sometimes these things have sort of short shelf life. So what do you think? Do you think this is something that's worth focusing on, or do you think this is something we could just sort of get past?
I mean, we'll see, I guess. I saw Ramesh Panuru had a funny tweet about this, where he's like, "What this is like if in 2015 the escalator bringing Trump down had just like glitched out and stopped, and he had to walk the rest of the way down, or like he tripped or something like that." Do I think it's ultimately extremely important? No. Although there's no replacing the moment where all of media is focused on you, right? That is kind of the point of announcing, is to get all of that earned media. Um, and where every news channel is forced to cover your rally or whatever it is, and there's no retrieving that moment for Ron DeSantis. So I do think it hurt him in that sense. But do I think people will be casting their ballots like in Iowa, many months from now based on this like glitchy spaces? No. I do think it's a larger. I think it might hurt sort of the Elon Musk project more, which actually is a project I'm maybe more invested in, to try to take some of these pivotal campaign moments out of the hands of traditional media. I think that's a really important thing to have to do, but this was not a good, sort of first foot out of the gate for Twitter as a media company. So
Do you think it was bad because it just showed that they weren't sort of ready for prime time?
yeah, I mean, look, they should have anticipated having that many people on the space. They should have been able. I mean, if Musk's whole pitch is like, we're going to make Twitter into this competitor, like a real competitor to, to legacy media. I mean, that they weren't that, right. If you look at DeSantis's launch or interviews, for example, on Fox or whatever, um, they went a lot smoother. And even I think even Fox had a headline that was like laughing at the fact that, hey, if you want to actually hear what Ron DeSantis has to say, come on over to Fox, where we're giving him the traditional interview for a presidential candidate. The fact that Tucker is moving to Twitter, right? Obviously, this is sort of what Musk is trying to make Twitter into, and this was not a good step forward, a good first step forward, I should say. And that, I mean, I'm very much in sympathy with that project, so I hate to see it fail, but in the this in the interest of being objective, like you can't say this was a auspicious launch to that project.
Yeah. I never thought of the the Musk project as competing with cable news as much as like YouTube and Substack. But no, I could see that too. Um, Yeah, I think the way I look at it is there's only like okay, so he's the guy who's behind, right? There's three polls that came out the last few days that show him about 25, 30 points behind Trump. This seems like everyone agrees this is the state of the race. And there's only a few chances of like, okay, everything has to go right and he can get that surge, right? And so like, the debates, assuming there's debates and assuming Trump shows up, this is one particular case, right? The launch is like one of like the 5 or 10 most important things. It's maybe the most important, right? It's certainly up there. And if the launch comes out, and I actually was reading like a lot of like media before he announced, and it seemed like the media got bored and they were primed for sort of a narrative of like this is the DeSantis comeback. There was a tweet from Steve Kornacki, which had something that I forgot, which is that like the Hillary Obama race in 2008. It was my recollection was like Hillary was always ahead, then Obama just eventually surged ahead. But it was like no, they tightened for a bit, and then Hillary like pulled back up. And so the question was, could DeSantis be like Obama in 2008? Like, okay, he had a little surge, he dipped a little bit, and maybe he would come back. So a lot of people were saying stuff like this, like, oh, don't count DeSantis out because the narrative, people get bored with the narrative, so they switch to something else. And so I think like there was almost like they were rooting for it to go well just because they'd have like a story to tell, right? And then it didn't end up working like that. Obviously, the glitch, and that just became the entire story. Um, and so yeah, this is difficult. I mean, never one thing is like the end of the campaign. But I think if like if like how could it have gone like 1 to 10? This is like 2 or 3. This is like close to the worst case scenario. Do you agree with that?
I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, again, I don't think this is particularly important. I do agree with what you said that there's, if you're behind, you've got to change something in the dynamic of the race, and you probably only get a few points to do that. No, I don't know that I agree that his launch was ever going to be that. I mean, I think something else has to change. There has to be a direct conflict between Trump and DeSantis, or something has to happen to shake up the race in some way. We still have a long way to go. There's still a lot of surprises in store in terms of what's going to happen in the country and in the world. But I mean, he is the one who needs something to change. And so to that extent, I agree that like he's missed one of what might be only a handful of opportunities to try to change the trajectory of the race. Whereas Trump he's the presumptive front runner. He can just sit there. He doesn't really have to worry, about such things. And of course, he's the meme lord, right? Like the stuff that the hay he was making out of this was just hilarious, right? There's no way it puts Trump at his best. Although I will say the interviews that DeSantis gave, the more traditional interviews on Fox I mean, look, maybe it's not what the Republican primary voter is looking for, but DeSantis does make a very good case about all of the structural deficits of the right and how to fix them, from sort of immigration to the unelected bureaucracy that seems to make so many decisions, political decisions in the United States. I mean, he really seems focused on the right problems to me, but whether that's actually something that the Republican base voter is more interested in, I have no idea.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I think he does have a grasp of policy. If this was an election of like smart right wing policy wonks, DeSantis would run away with it. It would be very easy for him, right? It's obviously not that. It's an election all the Republican primary voter who has all kinds of sort of idiosyncrasy. I think in like 2016, it was like, oh, we learned that like the Republican voter was not like National Review, right? National Review had like that never Trump issue, and it was like, oh, voters want something else. But it's also not like anti woke intellectuals either, right? It's like its own thing that's like not connected to sort of the sort of the intellectual space. And so it's like I think we need to like try to understand like the Republican voter on their own terms. And I think you're right. And DeSantis, I mean, when he talks about like accreditation of universities, like that's like a great issue for like a Republican to talk about. That's a great issue for someone who's concerned about the culture wars, right? It's not the it's I don't have any suspicion that any voter is going to find that attractive besides these wonky types. What do you think about the like the substance of the Twitter space? I thought it was very weird. I mean, I thought it was the strangest thing. Now, this is I can blame DeSantis maybe more directly for, unlike the glitch. It's like he gets there and he starts reading a stump speech. I mean, and that is awkward to just sit there on like a Twitter space and like read a speech, and you could sort of tell he was reading. He didn't even like make it sort of sound like he was like he didn't even make it sound try to make it sound spontaneous. And to me, that just shows like a bad understanding of sort of optics and PR. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was essentially that's why I think it actually reflects worse on first in some ways on this like new media project than anything else, right? It reflects that we still don't know what we're doing. And this is again a project that I support wholeheartedly. I think is really, really necessary for the media landscape. But, it was sort of amateur hour all the way through. We still haven't figured out how to make even the appearance of credibility in this new space for the average person. And so I think that's something that if I were Elon Musk, I would be like very heavily sort of planning and workshopping out, for example, what the next thing like this looks like, whether that's Tucker or somebody else, because this kind of winging did not work at all. Um, I guess I disagree a little bit with something that you said. I think the divide between the Republican base and say the National Review types, yes, there's always and obviously always has been a divide between people who sort of follow politics like you and I, like very, very closely, and people who are shockingly doing other things with their lives, right? That's always been the case, but I think the divide was more substantive in 2016. I don't think it was just a matter of sort of the intellectuals versus the hoi polloi. I think it was there were some substantive issues where there was a big disagreement between basically not only the establishment of the Republican Party, but most conservative intellectuals and the average Republican voter. I mean, immigration, trade, right? These are some big and substantive issues in which there was a disagreement. Now what we're seeing, I think, and again, I take issue with the idea that, for example, some of these cultural war issues that DeSantis is hammering on are quote unquote very online. I mean, the feeling that if you say the wrong thing at work, you're going to be fired is not very online. We have polls to back up that 75% of Americans feel they can't, say obviously true things at work without, running afoul of HR and the sort of culture police, right? And I think the 2016 wave under Trump, yes, had to do with some of those substantive issues like immigration and trade, but also with this perhaps ill-defined feeling that something very essential about the American way of life culturally was slipping away, that we were turning into a fundamentally different country. And I think that stuff is not quote unquote very online. Now, maybe it's up to DeSantis. I don't know if he can. Like, maybe he needs to retool how he talks about some of these things. Maybe he needs more everyday examples instead of keeping it on the policy level. Like, that's all could be true. And I'm not even really evaluating him as a candidate. I just think the response being that we shouldn't bring up these issues about woke corporations, for example, like that would take us backwards to 2012, in my view, to another completely failed iteration of the Republican Party.
Yeah, I think that you're. Yeah, I think that that's right. That a lot of these issues do poll well. I think you can even run on them. These things like critical race theory and wokeness and political correctness. I don't think. I think if people see it though as sort of as your main message, I don't think that looks good. I think that people sort of have this like category in their mind. Okay, a president should for like so when you ask people, in polls, like what is the most important issue? It's always the economy or it's something close to the economy. I think people are just like they have this idea that like okay, like the most serious thing you can do in politics is like budget and like high end sort of macroeconomics, like big picture, right? And that's fine. I mean, it's fine to bring up the wokeness, and it's fine to bring up these culture war issues which conservatives are winning on. But with the DeSantis, and I think this is a problem with a lot of right, and this is sort of gets to being too online, is that like it becomes everything. It becomes almost everything. I mean, in the Twitter space, and maybe this was the fault of the questioners, but there was not, there was very very little about economics, very 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 little about sort of inflation. And not like voters understand these things, but like they feel like people should be talking about them, right? And it's just not there, and that's the too online criticism. I think not that he has too far right wing views on these issues. It's just he prioritizes them too much.
So I've heard both, right? So it might look. I agree with you that usually the top issue is the economy, especially when the economy isn't going well. That being said, back in 2019, the economy was going well under Trump, right? And furthermore, for the first time, you had a kind of blue collar boom as well, right? So not just overall GDP, these kind of like top level metrics were going well, but actually purchasing power for the working class in the country was finally starting to edge up after very like stagnating for decades. So in all ways, the economic picture was improving before COVID. We were still at each other's throats, and not just some like elite online or whatever it is, but ordinary people still very much at each other's throats. And so to that extent, yes, I mean, if you're having difficulty making rent, right, if you're having difficulty making your grocery bills, that has to be the first priority for any voter. But I don't think these are side issues. Now, can they be talked about in a silly way? Like, is Kid Rock shooting up a bunch of cans of Bud Light? Like, is that really the top priority of any voter? No, right? Very few. But I don't know. I think actually some of this conventional wisdom stuff is backwards about economics and culture. I think it's a bit of a, what's the matter with Kansas sort of analysis, if we can throw it back to what's the matter with Kansas, where basically you have Democrats saying like, what's the matter with all of these white working class voters George W. Bush is dangling gay marriage in front of them like a watch in front of their eyes, and they're not voting their economic interests. They're voting on these divisive cultural issues, and that's illegitimate in some way. And I just don't think caring about the culture in the school that you send your kids to is somehow like an unimportant or secondary consideration to economics. I don't think that's how people think about it now. Maybe I'm very online, who knows? But like, I certainly spend a lot of time on Twitter. But I think this is kind of backwards. I think there is this pervasive sense, and actually that is the part of the Republican platform that appeals to a broader audience. Even people who disagree with us on economics, right, or disagree with the conservative analysis of economics, whatever that even is these days. I think that it has quite a bit of appeal to moderates, to independents. That being said, yeah, I mean, like, if you repeat the word woke 50,000 times in every interview, like, I can see how it just starts to become grating and seem like you're avoiding answering more substantive questions about the economy, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have to sort of differentiate what's going to work in a primary versus general election. I think the Republican primary voters probably cares more about the cultural issue than maybe. So he's not trying to win swing voters at this point. That's not the point. Well, like if this idea about being too online. So there was so you watched the Trey Gowdy interview. There was a question about what do you think about Russia and Ukraine, right? And he goes, well, the military's been politicized and we have wokeness in the military. And he does like 25 seconds of that. And then like 5-10 seconds of like, oh, we need a settlement in Ukraine. Like that's what I'm talking about. I think
Yeah,
that
that's actually what I was thinking of when I said like just using the word jamming the word woke into every answer. That question, like that answer came off as disingenuous, right? It came off as in I think the trick with the culture issues is probably to, talk about them, find a way to talk about them in a way that actually very much connects with the experience of, like I said, like people who are worried about being fired at work or worried about what their kids are learning. And I think that there's a way to do that that really is a very potent political force, even beyond the base of the Republican Party, because these are the issues where you can get 60 or 70% of Americans because everybody feels this kind of cultural noose tightening around all of our necks and people don't like it. And I think it is like, again, I don't think I just take issue. And I know that's not really what you're saying, but I've seen a lot of that analysis online. That's basically, oh, like, talking about these cultural issues is a niche thing. It's like something that elites care about. And actually, at least in my experience, it's kind of the opposite, that there are plenty of elites in the media who would desperately want to stay away from a lot of the cultural issues because they think that's like icky and what the rubes care about, and they want to talk about the quote unquote real issues, right? About whether the GDP has increased by, 0.5% or 1%. And I think that's just I think that's backwards.
Yeah, I sort of think about the way that like the Democrats approach these things, and like a lot of their views, a lot of the views of their coalition, as you know, are very extreme, right? Like they can't define woman, blah blah blah. I mean, they have just like the Democratic orthodoxy has been very extreme on gender, on race, on abortion, and all these different things, and they do like I think that Obama and Biden did a very good job, and Hillary did a poor job because she sort of led with this sort of identity stuff. But I think Biden and Obama, like, forget about their policies, but the way they go about it is like, oh, I'm just a normal guy. I'm going to make Americans' lives better. Republicans are uncaring, unfeeling people. They want to give taxes for the rich, so on. I mean, they really lead with that, and then like they do a good job of always pretending like they are just like the culturally neutral or moderate figure. Like I'm just the guy here trying to, be a technocrat and run the government well and balance the budget and whatever, help poor people. And then you have, the Republicans. It's always like they are trying to take your rights away. They're trying to do something right. It's never this like apocalyptic. The culture is changing. It's like presenting some kind of moderation. And I think that like Republicans sort of need to do, I think, a little bit more of that. I'm trying to think of like what the right wing equivalent of this would be. Maybe they can't because Obama and Biden know that it's like leftists, like basically the corporations and civil rights lawyers and parts of the judiciary and all these other DEI offices throughout every institution are going to sort of do that work for them. But I think that's the challenge here. Just like talking about wokeness, talking about the culture war, caring about these things, but also not seen as like sort of the aggressive side in all of this. And I think that's hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is just part of owning the media, right? The reason that everything is framed as Republicans pounds, right? The left has been the aggressor in the culture wars for 50 years. But whenever Republicans actually, or the right in any case, pushes back against anything, it's framed as like extreme or angry or like irrelevant, right? And it's really political malpractice on the part of Republicans not drawing this out. I mean, we shouldn't be allowing Biden to take that sort of I'm just a regular guy, moderate on these issues kind of stance. I mean, just start to list the things his administration has done, right? On Title IX, they've redefined sex. It doesn't get more radical than that. You know, what do you think if we had an actual media, right? President Biden, why did your agencies redefine the word sex in civil rights law to include gender identity, include, men walking into women's locker rooms and playing on women's sports teams? This policing, I can't remember if it's a dear colleague letter or what. I think it's a dear colleague letter, right? This policing dear colleague letter that suggests that it might be a violation of civil rights law to send police to the places where there's actually crime because there's a disparate impact, right? These are incredibly radical cultural stances that are right there in black and white coming out of the Biden administration. So, it seems to me that it's all you need to do, not all you need to be as a Republican, is brave enough to just start pointing these things one after the other and saying, well, what do you think? Maybe in a debate, right? Putting Biden on the spot and saying, what do you think about this thing that came out of your administration a year ago? You cannot dance away from this thing.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Of course, the media is sort of, the media's bias is sort of the main landscape here, that we're all operating under. Do you think Republicans like do a good job of this though? Because it's like they're not completely helpless. So like if you look at the Title IX stuff, right? They do stuff like all the time. Like I remember there was a Biden wanted to confirm some ambassadors or something, and Ted Cruz early in the Biden administration was mad because they were going to let the Nord Stream pipeline go through. They weren't doing what they could to stop the Nord Stream pipeline, and so like he like made this like a big priority and grandstanded about this. Was before Russia, of course, invaded Ukraine, and then the pipeline went away anyway. Um, but I never see that. Like the Title IX stuff, I never see that. I never see them, trying to like push on a civil rights thing. And a lot of these things, like a lot of, I think this gender theory, a lot of the civil rights law, a lot of the race-based policies, I think Republicans would have would have a good shot at, winning public opinion on, but they never do this. So can we blame the media for this when like Republicans are sort of, out to lunch on these issues?
Yeah, I mean that was the second part. Look, that's what I would call political malpractice. They're afraid, and either they agree on substantive points, which is more common than people think it is, right? Especially staff, like Republican staff. That the number of Republican staff members, important staff members, who are functionally on the opposite side of most of the culture war and like race and gender issues as the Republican base is high. But they're still operating. Many of them are still operating in this failed 2012 autopsy universe where the worst thing they could possibly do is touch a cultural issue even from 10 feet away, right? It's seen as divisive, and they're still really worried that the New York Times is going to write a bad headline about them, calling them a racist or sexist or whatever it is. And the reality is, I think I agree with you. I think the country is ready for a conversation about these issues because it has gotten so extreme that somebody who's brave and articulate can actually start to push harder on a lot of this stuff, and would actually end up putting Democrats on the back foot. To some extent, we've done it with women's sports, right? Um, and this is one of those issues that it is important, but is it the most important thing to the country's future that men not be able to swim in women's sports competitions, right? Like, no. But what it reflects about the underlying nature of our law and our society is extremely important. The ability to distinguish between men and women is extremely important. And so I think in some limited cases, I think you do see Republicans who are starting to put their toe in the water and realize, like, actually, these are popular issues. You don't need to be so afraid. But a large percentage of them are just that they're afraid to talk about it. And I don't see how we can ever win on something where even most of the representatives of the alleged opposition party are afraid to say anything about it.
Yeah, and so that's interesting when you said that Capitol Hill and sort of Republican staffers much better than I do. Is that right that they still a lot of them are sort of liberals on social issues? Because it was like with judges, for example, they used to go both ways, but now conservatives have done a pretty good job of vetting the judicial nominees. Is it true that like the stat like I think that most things are becoming sort of more polarized, but you're saying staffers not so much. Staffers are still there's often a lot of liberals working for conservatives.
Look, I have met quite a few people without throwing anyone individual under the bus, but I've met quite a few people who held views that I would consider to the left of the center of American politics in terms of cultural stuff,
Uh,
right? And they're working for Republicans. Um, a lot of times they just our whole apparatus in DC. Again, a lot of them hold the view that actually it is bigoted to open some of these conversations about race, right? It is bigoted to open some of these conversations about sex and gender. They are still so afraid of those words that it still holds such enormous power over their psyche. That I look, I think it's changing. I hope it's changing. Actually, one person I have not been particularly happy with his performance as governor, but I think his run really did prove something. Was Governor Youngkin in Virginia? Right now, you have a Democrat +10 state. Um, and it shows the broad reach that you can actually talk about. You can talk about education, you can talk about gender ideology in schools, you can talk at that time about critical race theory in schools, right? And you can actually bring people to the big tent of the party by talking about these issues, because there are a lot of people who are moderate on a lot of different issues. They might have voted for Democrats in the past, right? But who are very open to what Republicans have to say about what their children are learning, the trans issues, um, the fact that like we are unable to have meritocratic testing and admissions into schools because of racial preference, right? They're very open to be taught to talk about those issues even when they're totally not Republicans. On like almost any other issue, they might be for universal health care from the government, they might be et cetera, but they are concerned about these issues. I think it's the exact opposite of the way that people think about those issues in Washington D.C., which is those are the scary, hard right issues where you really only talk about it if you're directly talking to your base. And when you're talking to a broader audience, you need to talk about tax cuts. And I actually think, in many ways, it's the reverse. That actually, and tax cuts are not as popular a policy as Republican staffers think that they are. And a lot of this cultural stuff is more popular than they think it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. So the state of the race right now, like where do you see it? The conventional wisdom has sort of become Trump is, if not inevitable, the heavy favorite. How good of a chance do you think DeSantis has?
That, I mean, I gave up making those kind of prognostications in 2016 when I was completely wrong. Um, no, I mean, it's hard to say that this is not a similar setup to 2016, especially with everybody else in the race. Um, I think a Trump versus DeSantis matchup would at least be some kind of fight. I do think that the way that DeSantis has delivered on certain of these issues, I mean, you would have a real sort of matchup between rhetoric and results, and we'd see that. Although I do think there's a large element of trust in as well in there, where people just trust Trump because he's already pissed off all the right people. Um, so I think people just have that. There's a certain type of Republican voter who's lost faith, I mean, rightly, with a, the Republican Party after successive nominees. They keep being told, electability, electability. John McCain is electable. You may not like him very much, and his policies might be to the left of where you are, but like he's electable, so we should elect him. He lost. We should elect Mitt Romney because he's reasonable and soft spoken and doesn't attack Barack Obama in ways that might be called bigoted or whatever. First of all, he got called a bigot anyway, and he lost. And I think there's a certain type of Republican who's really, really fed up with being told essentially who's electable, especially when their guy won and the establishment guys lost. And so I don't know. Do I think that it's more likely than not that Trump will be the nominee? Yeah. But there's a long way to go. I think one of the factors that has yet to play out is how many of these other candidates are going to stay in the race, how well are they going to do, or whether it turns on pretty early on into like Trump versus DeSantis.
Yeah, and if you were so the way the question is that if DeSantis does have a shot, how does he do it? So he doesn't really like I thought maybe like he announces this thing and maybe he goes on these maybe he starts like actually taking the hammer like really trying to attack Trump, but now it's sort of this passive aggressive stuff. I saw this one video DeSantis War Room put out where it's like we can never let Operation Warp Speed overcome informed consent or something like that. It's like, okay, he's criticizing Operation Warp Speed. He's taking a hit at Trump. He's not even really opposing Operation Warp Speed. He just says, like, we can't let warp speed like trample people's rights. I thought it was a very sort of like Weasley kind of criticism, but it's always like this. It's like, I'll be the guy who's not on social media. I'll be the guy who's who cares about this and that. It's never attacking Trump directly. So, I mean, is that the right strategy, or does he need to do something else?
I mean, what is the right strategy? Nobody's been able to go up against Trump yet. I mean, he just calls you a funny name and makes everybody laugh and makes you look small. I mean, I don't know that there has been a successful run against Trump yet. So, maybe DeSantis has a new playbook to try, but it's certainly he's a formidable opponent in that way. I mean, I think from his launch, it seems like what he's going with is, Trump is funny and says all the right things. Okay, I'm going to do the right things. I've done them in Florida. Here's my track record. I mean, whether or not that works, I mean, the strategy, I think, is just, and this is an obvious thing to say, but if he can win one of those early primaries, if he can win Iowa the way that Ted Cruz did, um, although again, didn't help Cruz in the end, right? If he can win Iowa or New Hampshire, set himself up to actually have some delegates in his column, then maybe he can really turn to the rest of the field and say, what are you still doing here? It's clearly a two-man race. There's no figure like Obama, though, in the no equivalent figure in the Republican Party who can really lean on everyone to get out. Like Obama basically cleared the way. He made everybody drop out so that Bernie wouldn't get the nomination, right? Um, and there's no equivalent in the Republican Party, and there's a sort of prisoner's dilemma where it's to the benefit of each one of these other candidates to stay in. Um, and yeah, I mean that in that sense, it does look very much like 2016 to me.
Yeah, that's right. I think what DeSantis is doing, and here's what I think is the mistake, is he's running like almost like he's the front runner. I think he's running a very risk averse campaign in the sense that like where are his risks? He's playing to every part of the Republican base, right? Like, there's not a single thing where you could say he's against the Republican base. Like, even the Ukraine stuff, like, what he thought that Tucker, wanted him to say something, or what his picture of what the base sort of wanted. He sort of just gave that answer and then like walked it back a little bit, but not really. There's just no attempt to take a risk on the policy area, but also um, like no risk in the sense of like picking a fight with Trump or like being too sort of being like too aggressive and going after him. And I think what he's hoping to do is he just stands there like, Republicans, I'm the guy who gives you, no matter what flavor of your Republican you are, I'm the conservative candidate. I'm going to give you what you want. And then hopefully, what happens to Trump? He dies, or more likely, and this is not very likely either, but like he just like all the indictments and stuff pile up. Just the Washington Post just had a story about the documents thing, the federal investigation into that, and it's amazing. I mean, it's like Trump like cleared out the documents a day before like the FBI was coming in. They were he had a dress rehearsal for like hiding documents for the FBI, and they know this. I mean, this is incredible. This seems like it's going to be an indictment. The Georgia investigation also seems highly likely to be an indictment. So you're going to have probably two more indictments of Trump. And I think he's just like, okay, like if I fight with Trump, maybe he like destroys me. Maybe it just becomes terrible and I fall. So I'm just gonna sit here. I'm gonna sit here at 20% and just sort of hope something happens. And then I'm the guy there. I think that's the strategy. And whether that's the right strategy or not, I don't know. But it seems like that to me is what he's doing.
I mean, waiting for Trump to self immolate has not worked so far.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, uh, and I don't just mean that versus DeSantis. I mean that like we've had a long string of people waiting for Trump to finally cross the line to a point where his voters would turn on him, and that has not happened. I think it's very unlikely to happen despite these indictments. So if that's the strategy, I think it's probably a poor one. But um, you know, I guess stranger things have happened. I mean, I've been amusing myself with the possibility that Trump could win from prison.
Yeah,
Um, that'd be fun, especially since the president can't pardon for state crimes,
yeah,
and a lot of these things are state-based indictments.
yeah.
So,
So he'd be
uh,
sitting. He'd rule from a New York State prison then.
yeah, yeah, I don't even know what happens. The U.S. goes into a constitutional crisis. Uh,
Yeah.
but I mean, is that? Do I think that's likely? No. Do I think it's impossible? Also, no.
Well, they set the trial date for the New York charge of March 2024. So this is like around the time of Super Tuesday. So this is going to be the trial is going to be starting like while in the midst of the primary voting. And you're right. What does happen if he, I think it's probably the criminal probably take a while. I mean, the odds that he gets convicted and sentenced before he becomes, but like, what if he's president? Like the trial is ongoing. You're halfway through a criminal trial, and he becomes the president. Right? What does he do? He just shows up to the inauguration and then goes to his court date and then goes back. People love the show. That's why people want Trump. People, I think that there is a deep desire for the entertainment value, and it's just getting more and more entertaining as time goes on. I mean, you think like, oh, last season you can't top like January 6th or something. Like, no, he's going to be president from prison. It's like this show's going to keep getting better. It's like jumping the shark, but it doesn't jump the shark because it's like real life. So like you don't have to say, is this plausible? Like, no, it's actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a fun element to all of this, um, and Trump is a master of that,
Yeah,
right? There's just no way to compete with Trump uh, on that score. I mean, I think in that case, that particular lane, I think DeSantis would be an absolute idiot to try to compete with Trump, right? Maybe like, but I don't know that you can avoid it, right? Look at how he like eviscerated a lot of his opponents. It's not because he has a better, sort of platform. Although I do think there were important substantive elements, as I said earlier, that made him appealing to a large part of the Republican base. But yeah, there's a WWE element to all of this that is just unavoidable, super entertaining, and it happened here with this launch, right? Trump immediately tweets out like 6 different memes about, including a truth, a truth out, including a truth about his big red button. There's no top in that. You just can't do it.
yeah. He goes, my red button is bigger and stronger as Kim Jong Un of North Korea. Right, will tell you. And it's like, what do you say? The Kim Jong Un looked at your button, looked at DeSantis's button, knows that yours is bigger, and like, yeah, it's of North Korea. I love that too. It's like not the other Kim Jong Un. It's just so stupid. It's just like so stupid. But it's like, yeah, it's what the Republican voter apparently loves. Yeah, I mean the collapse, the self-immolation thing. I mean, it's even crazier at this point than it was before. The first indictment helped him. Like that's the consensus, right? Okay, a second indictment, a third, they're going to be like, I'm sick of this. Like, I don't think so. Like, I think that without question, not without question. I mean, there's always a chance that something happens. There's a straw that breaks the camel's back. But I think the most likely scenario is that these things help him. And then you have to think like the news cycle, like, oh, this launch like didn't go well for DeSantis. The news cycle is going to be from like now until the primary is going to be 2 more Trump indictments. Like that is going to eat up the whatever. What are we? We're end of May, so until like February. So that's like 8 months. Yeah, so you're going to get like a month or two of for each indictment, right? So like half the cycle is going to be Trump getting indicted, which Republicans seem to love, right? Which makes Republicans like him more. And like how much time and how much space is there for DeSantis to catch up? I don't know. If I maybe you just have to take risks. You have to sit there and you have to say, look, I don't know. I don't know. Like, do you say like the indictments are justified? Like he's gonna say like it makes him unelectable or whatever. People aren't buying it. People have seen Trump come back from everything. Like I almost wonder, is there a way to say like he's actually guilty or like he actually did endanger our national security? It would be a risk. Oh, the classified documents thing. Okay, Georgia. Yeah, we're not going to challenge the January 6th stuff. We'll say that was all a liberal conspiracy. But then he could say, well, national security is important, and Jack Smith did a good job. Like, could he do that? Could that possibly work?
No, I think that would be the totally wrong. I think what the only argument he has is to say I'm the one who's going to clean up the FBI. I'm the one who's going to clean up the DOJ. Like, these agencies. Forgetting for a moment about the state and the state indictments. Like, these agencies are spent much of the election in 2020 and in 2016 playing in American politics in a totally inappropriate way, and in a way that's, in my view, more scandalous than Watergate. And he says, I have a plan to fix this. Trump is mad and he's unfairly being persecuted, but he didn't do much about it for the first 4 years. And in a key part because he wasn't strategic enough about how to handle an obviously hostile administrative state. That's the reason he is where he is right now. I think whether that's something that lands, I don't know, but I think it's the only thing he can do.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the problem with this is that it's like you're constructing a narrative, or you're going along with the narrative in which Trump is the hero. Like, he was the president, he tried to do great things for us. There was the FBI and the deep state. And this is like, Republicans have been eating this stuff up in right wing media for the last several years, right? And it's still like a story with Trump as the hero. Oh, by the way, I'm DeSantis. I'm going to come be the guy to fix it. Like,
I mean, I think you can make the case that he may be the victim, but that he's a sort of dupe in all of this.
okay, you have to call him a dupe. You have to
yeah,
say he's a fool. You have to go a little bit
I think
stronger.
look, I don't really like the way that DeSantis is. I think passive aggressive is a fair way to describe it. Like, he'll sort of obliquely hit at Trump. He is at some point going to have to actually run against his primary opponent. The question is, if he does that, will Trump's voters basically never forgive him for it? And that's a real possibility. So I don't know. Look, I whether Trump or DeSantis is the nominee, what I'm more concerned about than who ends up as the nominee is the way in which. So what is worrying me so far about this cycle? Look, if we have, and I think Matt Walsh said this on Twitter, and very much agree with him. If we have a cycle where Trump and DeSantis are trying to outdo each other as to who is more conservative and more right wing and more representative of the Republican base, I think that's actually good for the Republican Party. If we have a news cycle where Trump decides to backtrack and hit DeSantis from the left, I think that's really bad. And I've already seen that happen, right? We saw the Nikki Haley, who's very clearly running for vice president in a totally disingenuous sort of way. Nikki Haley goes on and tries to hit DeSantis over the Disney thing, right? Saying like, oh, well, we welcome jobs to South Carolina, as though it's 15 years ago and nobody understands that this corporation has wielded direct political power on behalf of the cultural left, right? If we go back to that kind of framing in an attempt to hit Ron DeSantis, that to me is a disaster for the Republican Party. Or similarly, I saw not to overly elevate Laura Loomer, right? But she's interviewing some of these like grifter guys, a couple black guys who apparently follow Trump around all the rallies, like ultra Trump fans.
Blacks for Trump, yeah.
I don't even know if they're part of a group. I don't know, whatever. But like the guy is saying some really stupid stuff, right? Just completely stupid stuff. And there's this wing of sort of boomer Trump fans that eats this up in this really pathetic, like, Dems are the real racist sort of way. Like, just, he was calling DeSantis a racist for acting against critical race theory in K-12, right? That if that becomes the narrative that a large part of the Trump base picks up because it's against Ron DeSantis, to me, that's a disaster, right? Because it's playing into all the most important frames of the left in order to like flip the bird to Ron DeSantis. To me, this is the essence of cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Along those lines, what do you think of those ads where Trump is attacking DeSantis from the left on entitlements, on like Social Security and Medicare?
That I think is probably a really potent attack, and I mean, this has always been Trump has always run on this. I think it's probably a reality of where even the Republican voters are. That look, if you look at the math, it doesn't work out. Social Security was built in a time where people died in their late 60s or early 70s, and they had, 3, 4, 5 kids. That's not the world that we live in anymore. The math is wrong. But I don't think we're going to do anything about it until it actually collapses, right? Until the checks have to stop going out. And it's very clear that a large part of the country, including a large section of the Republican base, does not want to touch entitlements. So that I think is like sort of all fair in love and war. Like, yeah, that's a fair hit on DeSantis. It's an unpopular position that he took on entitlements. So, and Trump used that position quite as an attack quite often in 2016 as well.
Yeah. And then he got into office, and actually, the Obamacare repeal, actually, I think was going to cut a lot of money from Medicare. Well, was it just Medicaid? I think they were going to cut. Were they going to cut from Medicare too? It was,
I mean, there was no one plan
yeah,
anyway. There were like 4 different plans. There was the Graham plan, and there was like a different plan.
yeah. I mean, I don't like it, because you're right that like we're not going to repeal Social Security tomorrow or anything, but if you talk to these wonks on Social Security maker, they say eventually we're going to get to a place where we're going to have to either raise taxes or we're going to have to reform entitlements, and it's not good to be putting Republicans in the base in like the mentality of, okay, we're never gonna touch entitlements. Like, the Democrats think that and the Republicans think that. Then I think we're probably headed for a Euro style, social democracy, and I think that's terrible. So I don't. I mean, I think it's effective. I think you're right. But yeah, it's it's effective. But yeah, I wish Trump wouldn't do it. But
Yeah, I just see that. Whereas I just see that as a sort of the status quo, meaning that there are a lot of people. If you look at the math, that something has to happen with these entitlements one way or the other. Like you say, either we have to massively raise taxes to support them, or we're going to have to adjust the benefit schedule. We're going to have to raise the retirement age or whatever. Like, just show me the math where you don't have to do that, and I'll believe you. It's just a reality. That being said, it's a very politically unpopular reality, and Republicans have been, sort of shanking each other over this for quite some time. I don't see that as really a shift in where people are versus, that every one of those people, prior to DeSantis being perceived as the challenger and now actually being the Trump challenger in this race, every one of those people sharing that video or whatever of this guy calling Ron DeSantis a racist for doing something about critical race theory in schools. Every single one of those people would have 2 years ago would have supported Ron DeSantis in doing that. And so to the extent that this kind of, I don't know if I can swear on here or not, but this kind of poo flinging primary, right, makes people revert to positions that are completely kowtowing to the left. That is a very bad primary for the Republican Party, in my view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
damaging to the future of like what needs to be done.
yeah. Okay, so So we got Trump and DeSantis. We got a few minutes left. Let's fit Tim Scott into here. Did you watch Tim Scott's speech?
Yeah, I watched parts of it, and then I saw his campaign launch website and everything like that.
Yeah. What do you think? Is there anything here sort of worth analyzing that you're getting from Tim Scott you're not getting from, say, Nikki Haley or somebody else in the race?
I think he's more he's a better speaker and more appealing personally than Nikki Haley, in my view. So to that extent, but like I felt like I was in a time machine going back 15 years listening to him, or maybe back to 1983. It just
Optimistic.
didn't reflect. Yeah, it just doesn't reflect my understanding of the dire situation facing this country. Doesn't bring forward any serious solutions to the challenges this country faces, in my view. Look, I like Tim Scott, but what I said online about him is he's not a wartime consigliere.
Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. And do you think that's where we should probably talk about the substance of sort of, whether, what kind of message is actually, best. I do think, I don't know, like my instinct is that the Republican sort of base and the way that, Republicans talk about things has just gotten too negative for the public. Maybe you're right, even if you're right that sort of we're dire straits in this country. I don't think that like the average voter is that pessimistic. Maybe the average Republican voter is, maybe not. But I think something like Tim Scott, I think Tim Scott would be very, would probably be the most electable if there was somehow he got out of it. I think actually probably would be a smart vice presidential candidate. Um, but I don't see much evidence that like the voters want like just people who are angry. I just don't see a lot of that, a lot of evidence of that. I do see it on the Republican side, but not necessarily for the broader public.
I think it's much broader than that. I mean, all of those polls that ask about the whether the country's headed in the right or wrong direction, it's been above 70%. I think we're in the wrong direction now for years, right? So in the NBC latest poll, it's 71%, and that there has never been it's never been below 70% for the last 8 times. No, sorry, 9 times going back to October 2021. So for 2 straight years, you have above 70% of people saying we're on the wrong track as a country. And then that comports with long-term institutional polls. So if you look, I think it's Pew that does a like long-term survey where they ask about various institutions. So they ask about the police, they ask about Congress, they ask about the presidency, they ask about corporations, like big business, they ask about media, right? And what we've seen is a huge drop off slowly over the last 30 years, and then precipitously in the last 5 years of trust in every single institution in American life. And this sort of sunny, happy, optimistic talk to me does not comport with that reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that people will answer polls and they'll say, the country's on the wrong track, and I wonder how much of that's just reflecting sort of the media coverage. When you look at like the most popular, so like you look at Biden, for example, versus other Democrats, was generally the more optimistic about America. He doesn't talk about doom and gloom in our country going to hell in a handbasket. If you look at like the most popular senators, right, the Morning Consult does these polls, most popular senators, most popular governors. It's not like people who are like, it's not like, people who I consider, the most sort of pessimistic, right? It tends not to be like, I think JD Vance and Josh Hawley, I think sort of have a pessimistic message. Ted Cruz, you don't see much of that, right? Like, so the most popular governors are Mark Gordon of Wyoming, Larry Hogan of Maryland, Charlie Baker, Phil Scott. So you have these Republicans, right? Chris Sununu in New Hampshire, Doug Burnham, then DeSantis, then Greg Abbott, right? Asa Hutchinson's up there, KIV. The senators, I mean, it's basically, it's not the bomb throwers either. I mean, you have Sanders as number one, but after that, you have Josh Barrasso, you have Angus King, you have Amy Klobuchar among the top 10. So just looking at sort of which politicians sort of do well and which ones don't, it strikes me that the optimistic politicians tend to do better.
I think actually that there's a huge difference between sort of a likability poll and giving somebody real power and leadership. A lot of the people that you listed off, I imagine they have high likability because nobody really interacts with what they actually do. They remember maybe one or two things because they're not actually in the arena. If you're in the arena, you take a few punches, right? And not everybody is going to like you. But I don't think that really reflects.
What about governors though? That's senators. What about governors, right? Governors are doing stuff, and the voters who look at them seem to like this sort of the moderate Republicans as
But
they
they
always
also
do.
like Ron DeSantis. I mean, it's
Yeah,
first of all depends very much on the character of the state.
yeah.
To the extent that, for example, I think you started with Wyoming's governor, right? I think there's a real, very dangerous sort of trend where some people in red states really don't believe a lot of this stuff is coming for them. That's why you get the more extreme Republicans and stuff actually, or like political commentators like me or whatever, coming out of places like California, because I see where California was 20 or 30 years ago, and I see where we are. And it really is like the whole world has, the whole country is going the way of California very, very quickly. And I don't want that to happen. So, I mean, look, I think that and it could be, I could be wrong. Maybe people think it's actually just fine. I think they tried to, the overwhelming sentiment with Joe Biden was, oh, we want to return to normalcy. I don't think people feel we've returned to normalcy. People want to go back to the 90s. I think that's impossible. But if somebody can convince them that it's possible, I could see that being popular. But I think the majority of the country sees that this is not a good time. Like you don't have a morning in America sort of vibe. Now, maybe the right leadership can bring back that kind of vibe. But to my mind, I mean, like Trump won, and he ran a very angry campaign.
Yeah.
And even in 2020, he ran an angry campaign, and he still came pretty darn close. 30,000 votes across 3 states is
Yeah.
what put him in the presidency. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I think there is a critical mass of people who are not who are clear eyed, and I think they're right about it. I think they're clear eyed about the really sort of bad place that this country is in right now.
Yeah. So what do you think about this? There's this one Harris Harvard poll that we talked about that has basically the most popular politicians and the least popular politicians, and I broke them out. And so the most popular are Elon, not politicians, just figures in general. They asked about it goes Elon Musk, then Ron DeSantis, right? Backs up what you're saying about DeSantis being popular, but name recognition and all that. Nikki Haley plus 8, which I see you don't like very much. Vivek Ramaswamy plus 7, Tim Scott, and then the least popular are Hillary minus 8, Biden minus 10, Schumer minus 12, AOC minus 13, McConnell minus 24, and Putin right minus 48. So what's the pattern here that you see, if any?
We don't like any of our main figures in politics,
We don't
right?
like the main ones. Yeah, exactly. I think that's right.
Yeah, and I think that backs up my argument that Americans don't like where we're at right now. They don't like their leadership. It seems to be a bipartisan dislike. The main candidates that we're likely to get from each side are both very disliked. I mean, there's been some polls that show like 50% or more of the Democratic Party doesn't want Biden to run again. I mean, that's also connected to his age, but yeah, I mean, I think that it shows a continual divide between the politics that we have in Washington, D.C., and what Americans actually think is important or challenging or difficult about living in America in 2023 or 2024, as the case may be. And I think there is a huge divide there. I think Trump steered directly into that divide, and that's a large part of why he won in 2016. But I would expect some of those positives to drop the more familiar people are with these folks, right? Elon might be the exception because he's just not a politician. But I wouldn't expect those attributes to remain high. Like Vivek Ramaswamy, for example, can remain high because again, he's not really in the arena. He can make sort of these very astute speeches. I think he has some really good ideas. I don't dislike the guy. I don't dislike Tim Scott either, by the way. Like if I was asked in a favorability poll, I'd definitely say disfavorable towards Nikki Haley. You're right, but the other two, I'd say favorable. I mean, I like them, but I that's a different question to me than who to entrust the reins of power to.
Yeah, yeah. Like, I mean, there's some of these people like Vivek. The only people probably heard of him are watching right wing media. So I'm sure conservatives have heard of him more than liberals. Yeah, and we do tend to dislike the people who have power, right? McConnell. And why is McConnell minus 24? I don't get like why. I think this is just mostly an aesthetic thing. But we'll have to put a pin in that. I think we should probably talk about next time whether Americans are that pessimistic and whether they should be. I think that would be sort of a interesting conversation.
Yeah, and I can mansplain to you why I think McConnell's so unpopular.
Well, I'd love to hear it. Yeah, I just think people are lookist and ageist and sexist against his white maleness. That's the only explanation I have.
I think there are lots more reasons than that.
Okay. We'll do that next time. All right, Inez, it's been fun.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks, Richard.